Clara always believed that family meant loyalty. That love was the kind of thing you could press between your palms like a wildflower and keep forever, delicate, yes, but permanent. She grew up watching her mother iron her father's shirts every Sunday morning, the steam rising between them like something sacred, and she thought, that's what I want. That quiet, steady kind of love. The kind that doesn't scream or perform. The kind that just is. She carried that belief the way some women carry a lucky charm, close to her chest, tucked against her heartbeat, completely unaware that one day someone would reach right in and take it. That someone was her husband. And the day he locked her in the bathroom, she was already halfway gone. She just didn't know it yet. His name was Marcus. And she wants to be clear about something before she tells you everything, because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves comfort. Marcus was not a monster in the way movies show you monsters. He didn't have cold eyes or a cruel mouth. He laughed at her jokes. He remembered how she took her coffee. He slow danced with her in the kitchen on Tuesday nights when there was nothing good on television and the rain was doing that soft thing against the windows that made the whole world feel smaller and safer. He was, for a long time, the person she would have described as her person. The one. The only. She said his name in the dark like a prayer and she meant it every single time. Which is exactly why what he did nearly destroyed her. Clara met Marcus at 26, at a mutual friend's rooftop gathering on a warm June evening when the city felt like it was showing off. She remembered wearing a yellow dress, the kind she only wore when she was feeling brave, and laughing too loudly at something someone said, and then turning to find a man watching her with this expression that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't not a smile either. Like he was deciding something. She found out later that what he'd been deciding was whether to introduce himself, and that he'd almost talked himself out of it 3 times before he finally walked over and said, "You laugh like you mean it. I think that's the most attractive thing I've ever seen." She should have clocked it then, the way he framed attraction as something she was performing for him to evaluate. But she was 26 and wearing a yellow dress and the city was showing off, and she said, "I do everything like I mean it," and he grinned and said, "I'm counting on that," and they talked until the rooftop emptied and the string lights were the only things left glowing. They dated for 2 years. Moved in together after 18 months, which her mother said was too fast and her father said was just right because you'll know when you know, Clara Bird, and she did know. She knew the way you know when rain is coming, something in your chest shifts, pressure changes, and you look up. She looked up. She chose him. The engagement was lovely. The planning was mostly lovely. The early marriage was, for the first 6 months, genuinely, deeply lovely. And then, slowly, imperceptibly, the way a season changes not all at once but in degrees you barely notice, something began to shift. It started with small things. The kind of things you explain away because you love someone and love makes you generous with your interpretations. He started checking her phone more. Not dramatically, he'd just pick it up when it buzzed and glance at it before she could, and when she asked him about it he'd say, "I was just curious, relax," with this little smile that made her feel like her discomfort was the problem rather than his behavior. She relaxed. She told herself it was just a quirk. A small, meaningless habit. Then came the comments about her friends. Her best friend, Danny, had been in her life since they were 8 years old. They'd grown up 3 houses apart, shared Halloween candy and heartbreaks and the kind of history that doesn't wash out. Marcus had always been polite to Danny, but somewhere around month 8 of the marriage, polite curdled into something just slightly cooler. He started making observations, not accusations, just observations, like, "Don't you think Danny is kind of negative? I feel like she brings you down," or "She seems like someone who needs to be the center of everything. You deserve friends who celebrate you." And Clara, because she was thoughtful, because she had always been a person who examined herself before she examined others, took those observations seriously. She'd think about them while washing dishes or folding laundry. She'd replay her last conversation with Danny and look for the negativity he'd mentioned. She'd wonder if maybe he had a point. She is embarrassed now, telling you this. She is embarrassed by how long it took her to understand that he was not offering analysis. He was constructing a wall, one careful brick at a time, and she was handing him the mortar. By month 14, she was seeing Danny maybe once every 6 weeks. By month 18, it had dropped to birthdays and the occasional lunch that she felt vaguely guilty about, though she couldn't have told you why. Her other friendships eroded the same way. Quietly. Without drama. Without any single moment she could point to and say, there, that was the thing that changed everything. It was never one thing. It was always 1,000 tiny things, arranged so carefully that they looked, from the inside, like nothing at all. But let her tell you about her family, because this story doesn't belong to just her and Marcus. It belongs to all of them, in ways she didn't understand until much, much later. Her parents, Evelyn and Robert, had been married for 34 years and presented, to the world, as one of those solid, granite-type marriages. The kind that weathers things. They were not effusive people. They didn't hold hands in public or speak to each other in the soft voices Clara had always associated with romance. But they were there for each other, reliably, completely there, and Clara had grown up reading that as love in its most durable form. She had one sibling. Her younger brother, Daniel, 3 years her junior, who had always been the golden one, not in a cruel way, not in a way that made Clara feel diminished, but in the way that some people are simply lit from within and everyone in the room gravitates toward their warmth without thinking about it. Daniel was that. He was easy and funny and deeply kind, and she had loved him her entire life with a fierceness that sometimes surprised her with its intensity. When he called her Clara Bug, which he'd been calling her since he was 4 and couldn't manage her full name, she felt 16 years old again in the best possible way. Daniel had been dating a woman named Priya for 3 years, a beautiful, sharp-minded landscape architect with ink-black hair and a laugh that sounded like something good. Clara adored her. They'd fallen into an easy sisterhood almost immediately, texting each other memes at midnight and trading book recommendations and sometimes sitting in companionable silence on Priya's back porch with wine and no obligation to fill the air. When Daniel announced their engagement, Clara had cried in the genuinely happy way, not the complicated way, and she'd meant it. The wedding was set for the following spring. April. Clara was the maid of honor. It was planning that wedding that cracked everything open. The first sign came on an ordinary Thursday evening, roughly 5 months before the wedding. Clara was at her parents' house. She'd stopped by to drop off some centerpiece samples Priya had asked her to show her mother, and she overheard something she was not meant to hear. Her parents were in the kitchen. The door was mostly closed. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was simply standing in the hallway, arms full of sample boxes, and the words reached her before she could retreat. Her father's voice, low and strained, if Daniel knew, it would ruin everything. Her mother, quieter, he's never going to know. I've made sure of it. Her father again, something sharp in it, you can't make sure of something like this forever, Evelyn. These things have a way of... Enough. Her mother's voice, a blade slid flat. We've managed it this long. We'll manage it longer. Clara stood very still in the hallway, boxes balanced in her arms, heart beating in a strange, off-rhythm way. She waited a beat, then shuffled her feet and made deliberate noise and knocked, and her mother opened the door with a perfectly composed face, and nothing was said about any of it, and they had tea and looked at centerpiece samples and talked about chair sashes. But something had lodged itself under Clara's skin. Small and sharp and persistent. She didn't mention it to Marcus that night. She thought about it while lying next to him in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what she'd heard. Daniel knew what? What had they managed? Her mind offered up a dozen mundane possibilities and then a dozen less mundane ones, and she dismissed all of them and told herself it was probably nothing and went to sleep. She was wrong, of course. But she didn't know that yet. 3 weeks later, Marcus locked her in the bathroom. She wants to be specific about this because she knows how it sounds on the surface, and she knows the stories that usually go with that sentence, and she wants you to understand the texture of it, not just the act, but the meaning underneath the act. They had been arguing, which had become, by that point in the marriage, an increasingly frequent occurrence, arguments that were somehow always her fault by the time they ended, arguments where her initial complaint got turned around and refracted until she was apologizing for bringing it up in the first place. The argument that evening was about the wedding. She told him she needed to spend several evenings that week with Priya and Daniel, finalizing seating arrangements and coordinating with vendors. Standard maid of honor logistics. His face had done something subtle when she said it. Not a dramatic change, he was never dramatic, drama was too legible, but something withdrew behind his eyes and his voice went very even, very measured, which she'd learned to fear more than shouting, and he said, "You always prioritize everyone else. It's exhausting to watch." She tried to explain, the wedding was 6 weeks away, these were things that needed to be done, Priya was counting on her. He'd escalated in that slippery way he had, each sentence reasonable on its own but the accumulation of them suffocating, until she was shaking in a way she recognized as an adrenaline response but that her body had started labeling as shame. She'd excused herself to the bathroom, just to breathe, just to stand somewhere alone for 60 seconds and feel the cool tile under her feet and remember who she was. She heard the click a moment after the door closed. Soft, almost gentle. She tried the handle. Locked. Not the interior lock, she hadn't pushed it, but the exterior one, the antique turnkey lock they'd thought was charming when they bought the house and had talked about replacing and never gotten around to. She stood very still. Marcus. Nothing. Marcus, the door is locked. A long pause. Then his voice, from just the other side, almost casual, "You need to calm down before you come out and say something you'll regret." Her hand was still on the handle. She felt something shift in her chest, not outrage, not fear, though both of those came later, but something colder and more clarifying than either. Something that felt, oddly, like waking up. Like a window opening in a room that had been sealed for too long. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub. She breathed. She looked at herself in the mirror, this woman in the mirror, this woman with dark circles beneath her eyes and tension written into the lines of her mouth, this woman who had stopped wearing yellow dresses, who had let her best friend drift to the perimeter of her life, who apologized reflexively and couldn't always remember for what, and she said to that woman, very quietly, "What are we doing?" And the woman in the mirror didn't answer. But her eyes said everything. He unlocked the door 40 minutes later. She came out calm. She apologized, and even as she did it, some small observing part of her watched herself apologize and made a note. She made a lot of notes that night. She didn't write them down anywhere. She kept them inside, in that new cold clear space in her chest, the one that had opened when the lock clicked. She kept them safe. She started paying attention differently after that. She thinks of it now as switching from passive seeing to active observing, the same way a security camera just records everything without interpretation, and then someone sits down at a monitor and actually watches. She became the person at the monitor. She watched the way Marcus moved through spaces, social spaces especially. The way he was different at parties and dinners, expansive and charming and generous, the man everyone wanted to sit next to, and the way that same man folded himself back up on the drive home and said something small and precise to flatten whatever small joy she'd accumulated during the evening. She watched the way he spoke to her parents, too politely, performatively deferential, the way people act when they need to be liked by someone specifically. She watched the way he spoke to Daniel, or rather, she watched the way he avoided Daniel when possible, and when not possible, the way he stood slightly apart, as if Daniel were something he was appraising rather than a person he was in relationship with. She watched, and she noted, and she began, very quietly, to think. She also started sleeping more lightly. This is how she happened to be awake at 2:47 in the morning on a Thursday in February when Marcus got up quietly, or thought he was moving quietly, but she was at the monitor now, she was observing, and took his phone into the bathroom and stayed for 35 minutes. She lay in the dark and breathed and stared at the ceiling and kept very still and let the coldness in her chest tell her what this meant. She already knew. She had probably known for months in the way you sometimes know things before you're willing to let the knowledge become a thought with a shape. But now she let it become a thought. Now she held it up and looked at it. Something was happening that didn't involve her. She didn't confront him. This is the part people sometimes struggle to understand. Why didn't you just ask him? But here is what they don't realize about a certain kind of relationship. Confronting him would have meant giving up her advantage, and also, and this is the harder truth, confronting him would have meant having a conversation she already knew the shape of. He would deny. He would redirect. He would make her doubt her perception until she was once again standing in the bathroom of her own mind, locked in, no key. Instead, she started gathering information. She reconnected with Danny first. She texted her on a Sunday morning when Marcus was at the gym, a simple "Hey. I miss you. I'm sorry it's been so long. Can we talk?" And Danny, who was a better friend than Clara had deserved to be in recent years, responded within 4 minutes with 3 paragraphs of warmth and a time and a coffee shop address. They sat across from each other in a corner booth for 3 hours. Clara told her things she hadn't told anyone. Danny listened without interrupting, which took tremendous visible effort because Danny was a person of passionate interruptions, and when Clara finally finished, Danny reached across the table and covered her hand and said, very quietly, "Clara, I need you to hear me. What you just described is not a difficult marriage. It is a controlled one. There is a difference." Clara stared at her coffee. "I know," she said. And she did know. She had known since the bathroom. She had been catching up to her own knowledge for weeks. "What are you going to do?" Danny asked. "I'm going to find out everything first," Clara said. "And then I'm going to decide." Danny looked at her for a long moment with an expression Clara couldn't fully read, something like relief, something like sorrow, something like pride, and then she nodded. "Then let me help." The investigation, and that is the right word for it, because it was methodical and careful and she treated it exactly like a job, had 2 tracks. The first track was Marcus. The second track was her family. Both tracks, as it turned out, led to the same destination. She just didn't know that yet. On the Marcus track, Danny had a friend who was a family attorney, a fierce and meticulous woman named Sophia who had seen the full spectrum of what marriages could become and was not easily shocked. Sophia told her, in clear and practical terms, what to document and how and why, and what her options were, and what the process would look like. She spoke to Clara like a person who deserved to understand what was happening, not like someone fragile who needed to be protected from information. Clara found this enormously restoring. She documented quietly. Dates and times. Conversations she wrote down immediately afterward in a notes app she password protected with a password she'd never used for anything Marcus had ever seen. the locked bathroom incident, the comments about her friends, the phone. She documented the way the money worked in their household, the way Marcus had gradually, over 3 years, suggested that it made more sense for him to manage their finances because he was better with numbers, and the way she had agreed because she was generous with her interpretations and because she loved him and because she had not yet become the person at the monitor. She documented what she found when she started looking at those finances more closely, the account she didn't know about, the transfers she couldn't account for, the pattern that, once visible, became impossible to unsee. She did not yet know who was on the other side of those transfers. But she was going to find out. On the family track, the thing her parents had said in the kitchen had not faded. If anything, it had grown. She thought about it in the way you think about a word you've forgotten, not constantly, but it would surface at odd moments, snagged on something, refusing to dissolve. If Daniel knew, it would ruin everything. Daniel knew what? What had they managed? The words had the texture of something long buried, something heavy, something that predated her own memory. She started carefully. She called her father, not her mother. Her mother was the one who had said enough in that blade voice, and she asked him to meet her for lunch without mentioning Marcus and without mentioning why. Her father, who was a gentle man beneath his reserve, who had always been easier than her mother in certain emotional registers, agreed immediately, and they met at a diner they both loved, a slightly worn place with excellent pie and booths with real wooden seats, and she looked at him across the table and said, simply, "Dad." What is it that Daniel can't know? The color left his face so completely and so suddenly that she was frightened for a moment. She thought, for one surreal second, that he might be having a medical event. But it was just shock. It was the shock of someone who had kept a secret for so long that having it named felt like being struck. "Where did you?" he started. "I heard you and Mom," she said. "I wasn't trying to. But I heard you. And I need you to tell me." He looked down at his coffee cup for a long time. She waited. She was very good at waiting now. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, and he looked suddenly, profoundly older, and he said, "It's about Daniel's father." The world tilted very slightly. "What about Daniel's father?" she said, carefully. "You are Daniel's father." Her father looked at her, and in his face she saw a very old grief, worn smooth by years of carrying it. "I raised Daniel," he said. "I love Daniel like nothing else in this world. That is the truest thing I can tell you." But biologically, he stopped. Started again. "Your mother had an affair. Before Daniel was born. 31 years ago. The man she was involved with, his name was Gerald Ashworth." Clara sat with that name for a moment. Gerald Ashworth. It meant nothing to her. And then, from somewhere deep in her memory, some dusty filing cabinet of background information she'd accumulated over 3 years of marriage, a name surfaced. A name Marcus had mentioned. His uncle. A family patriarch type, respected, wealthy, influential in certain circles. A man she'd met twice at family gatherings and found slightly overbearing but fundamentally unimportant. Gerald Ashworth. "Dad," she said slowly, "Marcus's family, what's his uncle's name?" Her father frowned. "I don't know, sweetheart." "Why?" But she was already pulling her phone out of her bag, hands not entirely steady, opening the photos from Marcus's family Christmas 2 years ago, zooming in on a face in the background, silver-haired, substantial, standing with one hand on Marcus's shoulder in the way people stand when they own something, or believe they do. She found a caption in an old email. A holiday greeting Marcus had forwarded to her once. Gerald Ashworth. The cold place in her chest expanded until it filled everything. She sat in her car outside the diner for 45 minutes, just breathing. Working it out. building the architecture of it slowly, one beam at a time, because the alternative, letting it hit her all at once, was not something she was going to allow. She was the person at the monitor. She watched. She processed. She planned. Here is what she understood. Her mother had had an affair with Gerald Ashworth 31 years ago. Daniel was the biological result of that affair. Daniel did not know this. Her parents had kept this secret for Daniel's entire life. And Marcus, her husband, the man she had built 3 years of marriage with, the man who had locked her in a bathroom and drained money into accounts she didn't know about, was the nephew of the man who was, biologically, her brother's father. Which raised a question so cold and precise it almost didn't feel like an emotion at all. Had Marcus known, when he pursued her, who she was? She thought about the rooftop. The yellow dress. The way he'd said, "I'm counting on that." She thought about the way he'd always been slightly too interested in her family, in Daniel specifically, asking questions that she'd read as warmth and now reframed as something entirely different. She thought about the financial transfers, the account she didn't know about, and she thought, Gerald Ashworth is Marcus's uncle. Gerald Ashworth has money. Marcus needs money, or wants it, or is managing it for someone else. She thought about what leverage a secret like this would give someone. About what it would be worth, to the right person, to ensure it was never revealed. About a nephew positioned inside the family of the woman who knew. She called Danny from the parking lot. "I need you to listen to me," she said, "and I need you to not react until I'm finished." She laid it all out. When she finished, the silence from Danny's end lasted almost 30 seconds, which was a geological age for Danny. Then, "Clara. That is not a complicated marriage. That is a conspiracy." "I know," Clara said. "What are we going to do?" "The wedding is in 6 weeks, Clara said. "The whole family will be there. Everyone who matters will be in one room." She paused. "I'm going to let him think everything is normal. I'm going to be the perfect wife and the perfect maid of honor until the moment I'm not." Another silence. Then Danny said, in a voice that was quiet and absolutely certain, "Tell me what you need." The 6 weeks between that parking lot and the wedding were the strangest of Clara's life, stranger even than everything that came before, because they required her to perform a version of herself that she had already left behind. She came home to Marcus and she cooked dinner and she talked about ordinary things and she lay next to him at night and she did all of it with a steadiness that she recognized, with a distant kind of wonder, as strength. She had not known she possessed this kind of stillness. She was discovering herself in the process of planning her exit and finding the person she found there far more capable than she'd been led to believe. She worked with Sophia, the attorney, in quiet, careful increments. Documents were filed. Evidence was preserved. A timeline was established. Marcus, in his absolute confidence that she was managed, became slightly careless in this period, a small mercy that gave her considerably more material to work with than she'd had before. She noted everything. The cold place in her chest was no longer frightening. It had become her most reliable tool. She met, through Danny, a woman named Kezia who worked in investigative research, not a private investigator exactly, but a person with particular skills and particular access who was willing to help a friend of Danny's understand the full picture. Kezia confirmed what Clara had already assembled but added layers she hadn't been able to access alone. The money Marcus had been moving corresponded to payments from a holding company connected to Gerald Ashworth's business interests. The payments had begun 4 months before Marcus introduced himself at the rooftop party. He had been placed in proximity to her deliberately, or had placed himself there upon instruction. The documentation didn't tell her which, and by that point it hardly mattered. What mattered was the pattern. What mattered was the shape of it, spread out before her, unambiguous and complete. Gerald Ashworth had known about Daniel's parentage, likely had always known, and had, at some point, decided to use that knowledge. Whether for financial leverage over her parents or simply for power, the specifics remained partially obscured. What was clear was that Marcus was his instrument and she had been the means of access. She thought about what to do with this for a long time. She thought about it in the shower and on her commute and in the small hours of the night while Marcus slept beside her, this person she was now looking at through entirely different glass. She could feel anger when she let herself, tremendous, molten anger, but she kept it behind the glass too. Anger was weather. Strategy was architecture. She was building architecture. She made two decisions. The first, she was going to leave Marcus, legally and completely, with every document in place and every asset accounted for. The second, she was going to tell Daniel the truth, but she was going to do it on her terms, with care, in a moment where the people who had kept the secret were present, where accountability was not optional, where the constellation of lies that had built up over 30 years was finally going to be disassembled in the light. The wedding. Daniel and Priya's wedding. The entire family in one room, on a day that was supposed to be the most joyful of her brother's life. She turned this over in her hands for days, examining it from every angle, and she felt the weight of what she was choosing, the disruption of it, the collateral cost, the way joy and devastation would have to share the same room on the same afternoon. She asked herself, more than once, if she was sure. If she was being righteous or simply ruthless. And then she thought about Daniel, her Daniel, Clara Bug's Daniel, building his life on a foundation that had a missing stone in it, a stone everyone around him had agreed to pretend wasn't missing. She thought about Priya, who deserved a husband who knew his full story. She thought about what it meant to love someone well, and she decided that loving someone well sometimes meant handing them something painful with both hands, because they had a right to hold it. She called Daniel 3 weeks before the wedding and she said, "I need you to trust me completely on something. I can't tell you what it is yet. But on your wedding day, something might happen that is going to be hard, and I need you to know that I love you more than I have words for, and that everything I do is because of that." A long pause. "Clara Bug," he said. "You're scaring me." "Don't be scared," she said. "Be ready." She heard him breathe. "Okay," he said. "I trust you." She pressed the phone against her chest after the call and stood very still in her kitchen and cried for exactly 3 minutes. Then she wiped her face and went back to planning. She told Marcus, 2 weeks before the wedding, that she thought they needed to try counseling. She said it carefully, in a moment she'd chosen because he was relaxed and had had a glass of wine and was most likely to receive it as confirmation of his management of her rather than a strategic move. He agreed, magnanimously, with the slight air of someone doing her a favor, and she scheduled a session for the week after the wedding, knowing full well she would not be there for it. The appointment was a piece of performance, nothing more. She needed him settled and unaware through April 14th. April 14th was Daniel and Priya's wedding day. She will never forget the morning of the wedding. She got up before Marcus and she stood at the bedroom window watching the pale early light collect on the garden, and she breathed through the stillness of it, and she felt, with a clarity she hadn't experienced in years, the full territory of herself. Who she had been before. Who she had been in the middle of. Who she was now, standing at this particular window on this particular morning with everything arranged and everything ready. She felt something that was almost grief and almost relief and almost love, all three at once, pressing together in her chest without cancelling each other out. She put on her maid of honor dress, deep green, Priya's choice, and it was perfect, and she drove to the venue to help Priya get ready, and for 2 hours she was simply a woman helping her beloved sister-in-law into the most beautiful dress either of them had ever seen, and they laughed and took photographs, and Priya's mother cried and Clara cried a little too, the genuinely happy kind, because that was real. All of that was real. The love in that room was real regardless of what else the day held. She had arranged everything with the wedding coordinator, a sympathetic woman named Ray who, once Clara explained the situation in careful, factual terms, had looked at her with steady eyes and said, "You have every right to what you're doing. Tell me what you need." The microphone would be accessible. The timing had been accounted for. Danny, who was stationed at a table near the back of the reception hall, had her own assignments and was, as always, perfectly reliable. Marcus sat at the head table looking like exactly what he was, a man who believed he had everything under control. He was handsome and pleasant, and he squeezed her hand twice during the ceremony, and she squeezed back with a hand that did not tremble. She watched her parents, her mother composed as architecture, her father unable to fully meet anyone's eyes, and she felt, not hatred, but a kind of sorrowful clarity about them. They were not villains. They were people who had made choices and then spent decades managing those choices, and those choices had grown roots that reached into everything, including her. She watched Daniel stand at the altar with his whole heart on his face as Priya walked toward him, and she thought, he deserves to know who he is. He deserves his full story. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts. The reception. Cocktail hour had passed. The dinner plates were being cleared. The room was warm and lit with the kind of golden light that makes people feel lucky. The band was between sets. This was the moment she had identified, weeks ago, with the careful patience of a person who has learned to think in architectures, the moment when everyone is present, the noise has paused, the champagne is poured, and the air is open. She stood up before the best man could reach for his microphone. She smiled, because she had a feeling she looked most trustworthy when she smiled, and she said, into the room's natural quiet, "I'm Clara, Daniel's sister and Priya's maid of honor, and I have a few things I'd like to share on this extraordinary day." Warmth from the room. Smiles. Her mother's face, perfectly composed. Her father's, more careful. She looked at Daniel first, her dear, good Daniel, and she said, "There is nothing I have ever loved more consistently or more completely than you. You were the best thing in my childhood and the best thing in my adulthood, and you are going to be the best husband Priya could ever have. I want that for you. I want everything true and beautiful for you." Her voice was steady. She had practiced until steady was the only option. "And I think a gift I can give you today, a hard gift, but a true one, is this." She paused. The room was very quiet now. She could feel the change in it. She turned, very deliberately, to the table where Marcus sat, and beyond him, because Gerald Ashworth was there, had been invited as Marcus's guest, was seated 3 tables from the head table. With his silver hair and his expression of comfortable authority, she looked at Gerald Ashworth directly, and she watched the comfort leave his face. "I've spent the last several months learning the truth about my family," she said, still speaking into the microphone, still speaking to a room of 200 people in golden light. About a secret that was kept for 31 years. About a man named Gerald Ashworth, who is seated at table 7, who had an affair with my mother 31 years ago, and who is, biologically, my brother's father. The silence that followed was the deepest she had ever stood inside. Her mother made a sound. Her father's head bowed. Daniel had gone completely still, and she would replay the expression on his face for years, not the shock, which she'd expected, but something beneath the shock, some raw animal recognition, as if part of him had always known there was something missing and was now finding out what it was. "I'm also here to share," she continued, because she had not finished, because she had decided that if you are going to crack something open you crack it completely, that my husband Marcus, who is Gerald Ashworth's nephew, was introduced into my life not by chance but by design. I have the financial records. I have the documentation. I have 4 months of transfers connecting Marcus's account to a holding company under Gerald Ashworth's control, beginning before Marcus and I ever met. I have been, without my knowledge or consent, a piece in a game I wasn't told I was playing. She set the microphone down very gently. The room erupted. Not loudly, not violently, in the way rooms erupt when people cannot quite process what has entered them, and so they fill the air with movement and whispered voices and chairs scraping and glasses touching tables with uncertain hands. She saw Marcus stand. His face was doing something she had never seen it do, something that looked like a mask falling in slow motion, the charm and the management just disintegrating, and underneath it something ugly and exposed, and she met his eyes across the room and she did not look away. She was finished looking away. She walked to Daniel. She sat beside him and she took his hands and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "I'm sorry. I know this is the worst day for this. But I also know you. And I know you would have wanted to know before one more hour passed." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were wet. "You've known for weeks?" "Yes." "You carried this alone?" "I had Danny." He almost laughed, a shocked, fractured almost laugh. Then, "Clara Bug." "I know," she said. "I know." Priya, across the table, reached out and covered both their hands with hers, and she didn't say anything, because Priya was someone who understood when words were the wrong scale for something. The aftermath unfolded over the following months the way large things unfold, not in neat narrative arcs but in stages, some rapid, some slow, with reversals and complications and silences between. Marcus left the wedding that evening without a word to her. She had not expected words, and she did not need them. Sophia had already filed the papers. The marriage was being dismantled with the same methodical care with which she had built her case against it, and what Marcus discovered, to his evident genuine shock, because he had apparently believed his management of her was thorough enough to have covered everything, was that she had covered considerably more than he had. The financial documentation was complete. The transfer records were damning. He had an attorney, who sat across from Sophia in several rooms and accomplished very little. The settlement was, in Sophia's word, appropriate. Gerald Ashworth did not recover cleanly from the public revelation. He was not a man accustomed to being named in any room he didn't control, and the wedding had been full of people with phones and social connections, and the story spread with the particular velocity of things that are true and also extraordinary. His business associates were, by most accounts, not thrilled. His family was fractured in ways that would take years to map. He issued a statement, through a lawyer, that was so vague as to be meaningless, and the world received it accordingly. Her parents, her mother and father, came to her 3 days after the wedding. Her mother, who had never been the easier one emotionally, was the first to speak, which surprised her. Evelyn stood in Clara's living room, which Clara now occupied alone, the rooms still adjusting to a different air pressure, the quiet of them strange but not unpleasant, and said, "I am not here to excuse what I did. To you, or to Daniel, or to your father. I am only here to tell you that I am sorry. And that your courage is not something I deserve but something I am in awe of." Clara looked at her mother for a long time. This woman who had ironed shirts on Sunday mornings and said enough in a blade voice and built a life partly on a kept secret and raised 2 children who loved her despite everything. "I need time, Mom," she said finally. "I'm not cutting you out. But I need time." Her mother nodded. Her father, beside her, was crying in his quiet way, tears sliding down without dramatics, and he said, "We should have told him. I always knew we should have told him. I just kept letting her convince me." He looked at Clara with something very old in his eyes. "You had more courage than either of us." "I had more to lose," Clara said. I had to get myself out. Getting the truth out was it was the same motion. I couldn't separate them. Daniel took the news in layers, as large truths must be taken. The immediate days were hard, she knew this from their phone calls, from the way his voice moved between disoriented and determined. But Daniel was, at his core, someone who reached toward truth rather than away from it, and this held. He reached toward it. He had several conversations with his father, with Robert, who had raised him and loved him unambiguously and continued to do both, and those conversations were, by all accounts, difficult and necessary and ultimately strengthening. Robert's love for Daniel did not require the answer to any genetic question to remain absolute. Daniel came to understand this. It took time, but he came to understand it. The question of Gerald Ashworth, his biological father, a man he'd never known, who had spent decades aware of his existence without making any move toward it, was a different and more complex landscape. Daniel chose, deliberately and after considerable thought, not to initiate contact. He made his choices, Daniel told her, 6 months later, on Priya's back porch, the same porch where she and Priya had shared wine and comfortable silences and the kind of friendship that doesn't need to fill space. I made mine. I'm Robert's son. That's the whole story as far as I'm concerned. Clara looked at her brother. Yeah. He reached over and nudged her shoulder. Thanks for the worst wedding speech of all time, by the way. You're welcome, she said. He laughed, the real one, the full one, the one she'd loved her entire life, and she laughed too, and Priya brought out more wine, and the evening settled around them like something that had always been there and was simply, finally, visible. She lives alone now, in the house that was hers and is now fully hers, and she has done things to it that Marcus would not have approved of. She painted the hallway a warm terracotta color that makes the afternoon light extraordinary. She got a cat, a grey one with judicial eyes whom she named Evidence, which Danny found unreasonably funny. She started wearing yellow again. She is not going to tell you that everything is perfectly healed, because she doesn't believe in that particular kind of closure, the kind that means no scar tissue, no tenderness left in the old places. She carries things. Some of them are heavy. She is learning which ones are worth the weight and which ones she can set down. What she will tell you is this: the bathroom. That locked door. That click, soft and almost gentle, that was meant to shut her in. The 40 minutes on the edge of the bathtub looking at the woman in the mirror. She used to think of that as the worst moment. The moment of lowest point, of maximum confinement. But she thinks about it differently now. She thinks about how sometimes being locked in is where you discover the full dimensions of yourself, the parts that don't need the door to be open to already be free, the parts that were always going to find the way out. He locked that door. He did not know she was planning her escape. He did not know because he had fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had managed to get beside him. He had looked at her and seen someone containable. Someone who could be kept. He had never seen the monitor. He had never seen the woman at the monitor, watching, noting, building the architecture of what came next with the cold clarity of someone who has decided that their own life is worth the full cost of reclamation. She was there all along. She always had been. If you are watching this and you recognize something in what she has shared, if something in this story felt less like entertainment and more like a mirror, she wants to say something to you directly, from whatever distance separates us through this screen. There is a version of yourself that has been watching from behind glass for a long time. That person is not waiting to be rescued. That person is not diminished or defeated. That person has been patient and careful and observing, and she is building an architecture, and when the moment comes, the door is going to open not because someone unlocked it from the outside but because you were never actually locked in the way they believed. You will find the way out. You will wear yellow again. You will name the cat Evidence and paint the hallway terracotta and let the afternoon light do what afternoon light does when the house is finally, fully yours. And you will sit on a back porch with the people who were always yours, who waited for you at the perimeter and came back when you reached for them, and you will drink wine in the comfortable silence, and it will taste like the most honest, most hard-won, most completely deserved thing you have ever swallowed, and you will look out at the evening settling around you, and you will breathe. And that breath, full and unmonitored and entirely your own, will be the most satisfying revenge of all. This has been Clara's story. Thank you for listening.